Um, so, hi, I'm Chris. My Twitter handle is hidden somewhere on that slide. You can tweet me if you want to. And I'm also want to note that I got Commonwealth spelling past the American program censors at this conference. So I'm going to be using Commonwealth spelling liberally throughout the slides for this talk. So what is this talk about? I am involved with running community-run events, and we're talking about how to bring more people to those things. There will be mentions of companies in this. I've removed names and such like that because, as with all long-running projects that have involvement with corporations, they come and they go, and I don't want to speak badly of them, so I also will not speak well of them directly by name. So who am I? I'm a council member of Linux Australia, which is the organisation that represents open source communities within Australia. We provide advocacy on issues relating to open source users in Australia and to a lesser extent New Zealand. We also issue grants to worthy projects, and we underwrite events including linux.conf.au, which is one of the better open source conferences in the world. For a few years, I've been a fellow of the Python Software Foundation. I was elected to that position back in 2013. And as of earlier this year, I also serve on the Foundation's Grants Committee. I am also a number of things that makes me particularly poorly suited to talking about diversity at conferences. Being white, male, university educated, all of those sorts of things. So on that note, I'm not going to be spending much time talking about the need for improving diversity in the tech community because to me, this is really an answered question. We're not doing it well and we need to do it better. And there are people far more qualified than me on this subject to actually provide evidence, strong arguments, and there's so many talks on this subject. So my expertise is in running events for the open source community. And this talk is about running programs that can help increase diversity at events. And when I talk about outreach and inclusion, I'm talking about what we do to find and encourage people who wouldn't otherwise have considered our events and making sure that once they're there or interested in our events, they feel welcomed and wanting to participate. And this talk is primarily going to be looking at running funding programs. These are often referred to as diversity scholarships, opportunity grants, things like that. For events, these things can come in many forms. The simplest is to simply just give away free tickets to underrepresented groups of people. This can extend right through to paying for travel and lodging expenses for those people who can't afford it. So this talk is looking at events. There are other talks at this conference that are looking at contributing to open source projects in a code fashion. Why are conferences particularly interesting? So our community is one that primarily conducts itself online through mailing lists, issue trackers, IRC, things like that. New people coming to conferences, also new people who come to open source tend not to get FaceTime with people they're working with, and this can be a really unfamiliar way to participate in a community for a lot of people. It can mean adapting to a form of guidance and mentorship that people might not be used to. Whereas events where you get face-to-face time with people are really valuable. I mean, you are at this event, right? So you must have seen some sort of value in it. They're a great way to meet people. They're a great way to be inspired by lots of people who are important in your field of endeavor. And being at events is a great way to be inspired in a way that simply watching videos, catching up on notes can't provide. You know, you can hang out with at the hallway track. You can go to a talk with a group of friends and talk about it after the talk. On the same note, though, events, unlike anything else in open source, going to conferences costs money. If you're out of town, you will need to travel. If you live nearby, you might need to stump up for registration, parking, transport costs, things like that. And that can come on top of taking leave from jobs. So being able to provide the same opportunities to everyone is what we call equity of access, and conferences by default do not have it. And in inequity of access is a diversity problem because people who have barriers to attendance will not attend events. So the solution to this is to enthusiastically run outreach programs. And so a lot of this talk is going to be about money because when you're talking about getting people to places, just spending money in a targeted fashion can help deal with inequity of access for people who are underrepresented, who can't afford to attend the conferences. If you target the right people, you can literally throw money at the problem without thinking too much about it and get an okay result. You can compare this with things like the Summer of Code, like Outreachy. These require significant labour on the parts of the projects and the participants in order to get a good result. So really the only trick with events is figuring out how to get the money and how to spend it. So I've been doing this for about 4 years at PyCon Australia. We've been doing it as a conference for 5 years. And this talk is a case study in how we built up this program over 5 years, what decisions we made, what things worked, what things didn't, and how we're trying to make things better into the future. So when you consider FOSS events, especially annual events like conferences, the period of engagement with your applicants and signals of success can be different to other outreach activities that you do in FOSS. So with events, it's really quite easy to define your goals with a funding program. You can think in terms of the number of new people you want to bring to an event. You can consider simple demographics. You can think in terms of how much money you can get and how much you want to spend. The period of engagement for a funding program is also quite well defined. It's to get someone interested in your event, hopefully before it happens, to get them there and have them enjoy the event. And the other great thing about events is that if your event is successful, you can run it in a similar way year on year, and you can run exactly the same program year on year and get a relatively similar result. The flip side is that tracking the long-term benefits of your efforts are quite difficult. Once the event is over, it's not immediately obvious whether you've succeeded in a meaningful way that extends beyond your event. So in the case of PyCon events, we like our recipients to engage with the Python community in some way. There's a lot of ways that people can start contributing once they've been to an event. This could be through code contributions to open source projects, starting or speaking at user groups. So conferences are really only a transient part of the year for the community, but the engagements that your program results in will show up in unrelated places that you as a conference organizer might not be able to track, which can be disheartening if you're not going out and actively looking for it. So a bit about the conference itself. It's our regional edition of a global series of conferences. There's about 30 PyCons throughout the world at the moment, maybe 40. And in general, these are all locally organized. So whilst many get sponsorship and grants from the Python Software Foundation, they're run independently of the global organization. The only conference that the PSF runs itself is the big PyCon that happens somewhere in North America every year. The only real requirement the PSF has for using the PyCon trademark is having a code of conduct and things like that. So our conference is one of the more established PyCons. We started with 200 attendees 5 years ago. We've finally doubled that number. We had about 450 people this year. We're the biggest PyCon within 9 hours of flying, which means that we need to be good and we need to be welcoming because we're basically the place that people can get to in our geographic region. We've run in 3 different cities with 3 different volunteer-driven teams. This year, 2016, we're running to our 4th city. And we've always run on events, which this makes the event easier to access for enthusiasts, students, people who can't get the day off. Whereas professionals, well, you know, they can live with it. So I mentioned PyCon US. They make a really big deal about financial assistance. This year it spent more than $200,000 in aid to attendees. These are really big numbers for people who are just getting into events to consider. They have a big budget. They can spend commensurately more than something at a regional level can do. So we're much smaller. We had 450 attendees this year. The conference itself ran on a budget of about 160,000 Australian dollars. I'm going to interchange between US dollars and Australian dollars throughout the rest of this talk. Generally, the buying power is the same in terms of money, so I won't mention the unit of currency too much. We gave between about 5 and 8% of our budget to funding this year, depending on how you track certain things. And our conference has two key parts. The first is your standard presentation and tutorials type of things, an event like this one. We also have a thing called sprints, which are where we give a room to people for 2 days after the conference, and they can work on open source projects in a mentored fashion, usually with high up members of projects. So there's an opportunity for people who come to the conference to come and contribute code. So speaking is not the only concrete thing that comes out of our conference. So we've been doing financial assistance for 5 years of the 6 that we've run. I was only directly in charge as a lead organizer for 2 of those years. For the following 2 years, I ran the financial assistance program within the context of someone else's vision and some treasurer's budgetary framework. So making it work within somebody's expectations of how money was going to be spent by the conference. So the main part of this talk is a retrospective of why we started offering a funding program for our attendees and how we've built it up and how it's changed year on year. So we start with 2011, which is the first time we ran a program like this. I wasn't closely involved with the conference at this point. Credit is due in particular to Tim Ansell, who started this effort up in Sydney all those years ago. So between our first conference in 2010 and our second in 2011, the mood around open source conferences really quite drastically changed. A whole series of events resulted in us realizing that we weren't doing diversity, particularly gender diversity, particularly well. It became clear that codes of conduct were a necessary thing. And an event that happened at LinuxConf AU in 2011 made it really obvious to us that this was something we needed to take seriously. It was really clear that we weren't doing the right thing by gender diversity. It needed to change. So that year, the PyCon AU organizing team adopted an official policy of improving gender diversity. This was a big thing at the time. And in doing so, the conference doubled the proportion of women at the conference in terms of, so it went from, I think, 5% of attendees to 10. And by actively going out and inviting people, suddenly we went from 1 female speaker at the conference to having 20% of the conference, including 2 of the 3 keynotes. So going out and inviting people was a seriously useful process. We adopted a code of conduct for the first time, and grants for improving gender diversity were adopted for the first time. And the program was pretty simple because it was intended to be budgeted entirely out of the conference's revenue. There were 2 grants, one for just a ticket for somebody within the Sydney area, and another for a ticket plus $500 in travel expenses. And the process basically was that people would send in an application to an email address, and they would be reviewed by a panel of anonymous reviewers, and they'd figure out who the grants went to. The problem was that there were far more people applying than we could afford to send to the conference. They were all really, really worthy. They should all have been able to attend. And now, when the program was being designed, we were expecting 300 people to the conference. When the program was being designed, we were about here in terms of sales. And when we had to give out the grants, we were here. Less than half of our projected attendees. Something happened in the last month that meant that they got the number of people they expected. But the conference was massively under projected revenue, which meant that giving out grants to everybody was not really a viable option. So the solution was to go out and seek corporate sponsorship for this. And we got quite lucky in a really short time frame. We found a sponsor who was happy to step in and fund the entirety of the program, including tickets for every single genuine application. So finding a like-minded partner like this meant that we were able to let everybody who wanted to take part. And it also meant that our program was able to go from being a token contribution on the part of the organisers to being something that really drastically increased the attendance of the conference and the diversity of the conference, which was fantastic. So 2012 was when I first took on the organisation role at the event. PyCon AU runs on a 2-year rotation. This was the first of 2 conferences my team ended up running. And basically the idea that we now tell to our organisers is that year 1 is where you try and replicate the previous event. Basically do what the previous team did in the previous year. And the second year you can go off and make it bigger and better. This was the first time the conference ran outside of Sydney. There's 4 million people in Sydney. More than 50% of the attendees in both the first 2 years came from that city. Most of the financial services industry in Australia is based there. Most of the tech startups are based there. If you're thinking in terms of the US, this would be like running an event in San Francisco or running it in New York. So Australia is basically the same size as the USA. The contrast is terrible, but you can probably tell the outline of Australia in that. It's basically the same size, except there is one major difference, which is that Australia is really, really sparse. All those yellow bits there are where a reasonable number of people live. The grey stuff is where people do not live. So you can't really road trip between cities. You can't fly. To plan any national event, you need to expect people to fly between cities, basically. There's significant travel involved with getting anywhere. National cohesion is an interesting issue in Australia in terms of developing a tech community, because you can't just bump between cities. You have to go to places and deliberately go to places. So we made it doubly hard for ourselves by moving from Sydney to Hobart. It moved to Hobart because that's my hometown, but it's also a city of 200,000 people. And we ran it on an island, and we ran it in the middle of winter. It's quite cold down there. And at the time, we didn't really have much of a local tech community to sustain the event locally. So we really needed to get people to travel from interstate. So the idea of replicating the exact event that we had in Sydney, kind of silly. The good news is that we started really, really early with the sponsor that we engaged in 2011. So the conference ran in August that year. I was speaking to them in September. They came back to us with $5,000 to run an event. So this let us run 10 travel, accommodation, and registration grants. And we still kept on targeting these at women. So the program grew on 2011 and allowed us to offer more meaningful grants to more people. The other thing that I discovered this year is that people are really, really terrible. People would complain to us on the internet saying that we were being charity for women, and this was a terribly insulting thing to do. This was entirely the point of the program, to get more women to come to the event, and it was an act of charity, I guess. And it's fashionable to say don't feed the trolls, but realistically, it's disheartening. We're volunteers trying to run an event, and dealing with trolls is a terrible waste of time. But we did also get one really good data point from this. The person we spent $500 on in 2011, she came back to the conference. She came back as a speaker, and her circumstances had changed as a direct result of coming to our conference. Her circumstances had changed to the point where she could self-fund her trip. This was the first real evidence that our approach was working, which was fantastic. So 2013 was the point where we could extend the conference beyond what the previous team did. That year, I also personally got a chance to travel to PyCon US in the Bay Area and see what our bigger cousin did and to meet people from around the global Python community. And their financial aid program was a huge factor in me being able to do that, which I'm still very, very grateful for. So before 2013, we didn't have speaker assistance at all. The only assistance we were giving was those gender diversity grants. This meant that most of our presenters only came from Australia, and they were generally people who could afford to fund themselves to the conference. So even with free tickets, only people who could afford to come to the conference did, which made us realise that speaking is also a thing that has an equity of access issue. And being able to bring people from internationally was also a thing that we couldn't really do before. And we decided we wanted to do that. And thanks to the fact that our corporate sponsor did stick around for a third year, we spoke to them about what we wanted to do, and we were able to restructure the way we offered our grants. We basically followed PyCon US's lead on financial aid because they've been doing it for a long time. Copying what they did seemed like a really good idea for us. So we decided to enable our program to support speakers as well as attendees. Some conferences run these things separately. We ran them together. And the basic model we adopted was to have a capped budget. So we set an overall budget for the program. We removed the cap on individual grants. So we would consider any reasonable request for travel funding and accommodation. The only requirement on accommodation was that you twin shared a room, or you got a grant to the effect of twin sharing a room, which in theory will make your accommodation budget twice as efficient. More on that later. We also removed the restriction on gender from our application process. The primary motivation for this was to make sure the program was equitable for anybody who wanted to speak, regardless of their background, which also meant that we could open up the program to other groups of people who had difficulty accessing the conference. And we were able to go from $5,000 that we'd received from funding from our sponsor to $12,500. We were actually able to grant more to women than we did when we were only allocating funds from our sponsor. One way we were able to do this was to give out grants in a phased fashion. So as we saw more revenue come in from the conference, as we saw that we were able to afford giving more grants, we directly allocated to those. So as money came in, we gave out more grants. So we removed that cap on, or that restriction on gender. How do we go about making sure that we still got women applying to this thing when we weren't directly targeting them ourselves? Well, rather than doing it ourselves, we encouraged people from PyLadies groups throughout the world, Geek Girl dinner groups throughout Australian mainland cities, university student societies to work on doing the targeted messaging for us. They already have groups of people who are worthy, who would make great applicants. And so they're much better at finding great candidates than we ever were. And the applicants that we got really strongly improved in quality, which was fantastic. And quite interestingly, we on the organising team stopped getting concern trolled, which meant that we were able to be more efficient as organisers, which was fantastic. So 50% of our funds went to women. The same number of women were awarded grants, but we were also able to bring in more local students because once we stopped thinking about the raw number of grants and instead thinking about how much we spent in total, it became much easier to just go and give out free tickets as opposed to just having one person maybe only claim a free ticket out of a $500 grant. And we were giving proportionally more money to women than their attendance at the conference. We still only had about 20% of overall delegates as women that year. So we're granting well in excess of the size of that particular group in terms of the conference population. But we were able to open up the conference to many, many more groups. University students from interstate, high school computer science teachers. People in these categories are often force multipliers because they can take what they've learned at the conference, go back home and be really, really enthusiastic at groups of people who would never have thought to go to the conference. We were also able to attract a speaker from Asia to attend on our assistance scheme, which meant that we became a much more geographically diverse conference as well. Um, so the main thing that happened to us in 2014 was that we lost that sponsorship base. This didn't happen for any reasons of malice. It's just the person who we were talking to and was really enthusiastic um, left the company or changed roles. The new contact we had there didn't know us, wasn't quite as passionate about our event. These things happen. We needed to figure out a way to deal with it. So the original $5,000 program that we ran probably could have translated to something that we could fund ourselves. The $12,000 program that we ended up having was much, much harder to justify. So I personally wanted to replicate this program, but we didn't have the money to do it. So how did we sort it out? Well, we looked at PyCon US, and they have a really long-standing tradition of everybody who attends the conference paying to attend. Speakers, volunteers, the lead organizers. These days, this is justified by way of their financial assistance program. Jesse Nola has a great essay called Everybody Pays that he wrote when he was chair of PyCon that does a really good job of explaining why this is the case, why everyone pays, and why it works. It's a really strong value judgment on the part of PyCon. They feel making the conference inclusive to everyone is more important than making the speakers feel special. PyCon AU previously hadn't gone down this road. So the main argument in favor of making everyone pay is that these days most speakers who work in open source weren't there as hobbyists. Python is no exception. People are attending on their employer's dime. And if you're self-employed in Australia, there's also really good tax incentives for people who self-fund conference trips. So basically, most of our speakers, we figured, would be in a position to claim their registration as a business expense. The flip side is that we sort of remove the real recognition we gave to speakers for their work. Free registration is often seen as payment in kind for coming along to an event and sharing things. So having to pay to present your own work is rightly criticized by many people. There are some conferences that do this with absolutely no recourse for speakers to not pay. So in the absence of anything else, I tend to agree that making speakers pay is a terrible thing. It means that there exists a certain amount of privilege associated with simply being able to speak. So here's what we did. When we accepted proposals, we told speakers that by default, they would be charged for their attendance, but they could send us an email and we would waive that cost of attendance. We also had a policy which we told the speakers that every dollar we raised from speaker registrations would be offset against the financial assistance program. In return, we enthusiastically prioritized speakers for financial assistance. We almost never turned down a request for expenses to be covered for a speaker. So the key to making this work was two things. The first is to make sure that we waive costs without question, because that is a positive experience for a speaker. It shows that we value the needs that they have, and as organizers, it's really not worth our while to get into an argument with a speaker, because that's going to make them enjoy the event less. Speakers are really, really valuable voices in the community, and the more they say in our favor, the better. So given that we started asking our presenters to pay, we adopted the same policy for the conference organizers. Everyone on the core team, from the lead organizer down, paid for a ticket. And this worked really, really well. We didn't just recover the shortfall from losing our sponsorship, we raised more. And when you consider that we no longer need to sink the costs of speaker tickets, the overall effect on what we were able to spend in the budget is in the order of 10 to 11K. So the result of this experiment is that we now have a reliable stream of income that is repeatable year upon year. This means we can continue to run our funding program without needing to worry about where the money is coming from. It's a thing that we can repeat in our budget. So in 2014, we stumbled upon a way of making the thing financially sustainable. It proved repeatable in 2015. But when I'm talking about making it sustainable, there's another thing to consider. This is a volunteer event. And making the program easy to run is an important factor in getting volunteers to enjoy what they do and reducing the burnout that your volunteers have. So when running a program like this, there are things that you need to do. You need to assess applications, but and give out awards. Otherwise, there is no program. But there are other tasks that we brought upon ourselves. Coordinating room shares at hotels, categorizing expenses, so making sure that each category of expense we offered, they weren't exceeding or whatever. These proved to be generally unnecessary and a waste of time for volunteers. So in 2015, we stopped considering travel reimbursements and accommodation expenses separately. Instead, we just gave them an amount and said, go and spend this on travel and accommodation. And we still gave out registration costs separately. And this worked really, really well. Not only did we not need to waste time booking hotel rooms and coordinating room shares, it turns out that enthusiastic recipients of grants are really, really happy to work hard to find good value in their accommodation dollar. Groups of friends will coordinate and find Airbnb shares. People will find hotels that are a walk further away from the conference than maybe the conference venue is, but spending much less on it. They'll go out and be efficient, and more efficient than we as volunteers have the capacity to be. It turns out this also caters better for people who have special needs for accommodation, people who have legitimate needs for more privacy. For me, room sharing at PyCon US was one of the more rewarding experiences of my life in open source, but understandably, not everybody is going to have such a positive experience. In 2015, we also ran a day for people working in education, which was great for us because it meant that we could increase the number of teachers who came along to the main part of the conference. Thanks to Nick Coughlin, who worked with the Python Software Foundation, we were able to introduce a pilot financial assistance program for teachers. So as well as covering costs of travel for people from out of town, we sought to solve a really interesting issue that affects this industry. Many schools have professional development budgets for teachers. Events like ours, definitely applicable, even though they're not education events per se, they're relevant to their subject matters. So registration and travel costs, not an issue for teachers, but bizarrely, substitute teachers are not included in professional development budgets for teachers. So teachers can't go to conferences that run in school term. They can only take training during holidays. So our program, as well as offering travel where necessary, we offered to cover the costs of substitute teachers for that day so that teachers could attend the conference during the school term because there was no financial impact on the school's substitute teacher budget. And we got teachers on that basis, which was fantastic. So that's how we've built and grown the program over 5 years. I talked earlier about it being difficult to judge the overall performance of what we do, but here's some nice anecdata that I've discovered when running this. The first is that every year since 2012, we have had a past funding recipient propose talks and talks of the quality that our independent program committee thought was worthy of speaking at the conference. So we've had people come back as speakers enthusiastically. Past funding recipients are often really, really grateful for their opportunities. They go and tell their friends back home, and very often applicants in subsequent years thank the friends who told them about it for letting them know that this was a thing. Finally, we see people who've participated in our events as students come back once they're in the workforce, paying their way as professional delegates, and they often cite their participation in PyCon Australia as their main reason for staying in tech. Or even better for us, seeking out jobs that let them do Python. So finally, a grab bag of things that we've discovered over the last few years that we are planning on implementing. The first is that being open to everyone meant that unexpected people could apply to our program. We weren't expecting teachers and students to apply in 2013, but they did. People from unexpected geographic areas that we didn't target sent us applications. If you're trying to enable improving diversity, it's important not to offer solutions to to these issues in a cookie cutter style. Diverse people have diverse access issues to conferences. Being flexible to people's requests and needs, and telling people that we will receive these requests enthusiastically is really, really helpful. Offering a rigid set of grant types actually turned out to be really discouraging to people, and removing restrictions and telling them that we would waive restrictions on grants actually got people to apply. And we discovered that when you give applicants an amount of money to spend and let them spend it how they wish, there's a lot less work for us. Nobody likes categorizing expenses. Inflicting that upon volunteers is really, really stupid. So not doing that makes the task really, really easy to reproduce. And it turns out that having an ad hoc funding system means that it's much easier to handle unusual requests. Unusual accommodation needs arising from physical or mental disability, improving disabled access for people who we haven't already catered for, or enabling things for people for whom travel is not an issue. Surprise, we'll definitely be doing this in an ad hoc fashion in 2016. When you're looking to bootstrap a program like this, going out, finding like-minded companies who publicly support diversity in tech can be a real help. Figure out what they're willing to support and work with them to build a program around what they would be willing to pay for. This may mean that you will not be able to run the program that you want to, but it's still a good way to start this thing up while you find the funding to run the program that you want to. As with anything like this, expecting 100% of your effort to lead to new contributors, new speakers, really grateful people in general, that's not reasonable. In general, people will be really grateful and appreciate the opportunities you give to them, but things attract jerks. People will be terrible. Accept that this will be a result, but take the good results that you get along with that. I stole this one from PyCon US's current financial assistance chair. They budget 50% more than they ever intend to spend on their financial assistance program. And that makes it much easier to give grants to everybody who you would want to give grants to. If offering an extra $500 to get somebody from slightly further afield to your conference isn't going to push you over the budget, you'll be much more likely to offer that grant. It also means you can handle unexpected blowouts in individuals' grant requests compassionately, and it also means you can handle last-minute grant requests easily without having to think too much about it. Along with that, most applications to programs like this will be genuine. If you're in a well-off country, you might get one or two people who are trying to do visa scams, but people from far-flung places can often genuinely want to attend your thing. But they're also really, really expensive to get there. If you can't award grants, go out and look for things that are closer to them and make them aware of it. Contact the organizers of those nearby events and say, hey, there are these people who are sufficiently interested to travel halfway around the world to our thing. Surely you can help them get to the thing that's 2 countries across. That's the thing you should do. Be compassionate to the people who you decline, because they will continue to participate in the community, even if you can't directly offer that yourself. So this is the end of the talk. You can find out more about our conference at pyconau.org. PyCon Everyone Pays by Jesse Nola is a great write-up on why PyCon has that policy it does. The organizer of PyCon US's financial assistance program wrote up everything I've learned about running a financial aid program, which explains the budgeting approach and dealing with visas for people from far away. I didn't get a chance to talk about doing t-shirts, but that's something I'm also quite enthusiastic about. So if you want to talk to me about that, you should do so. So thanks to everybody who's been involved with making these things happen over the last few years, and everybody who's attended PyCon EU thanks to these programs. And that is all the material I have. I'm happy to take any questions for a minute or so. Okay. Oh, there. But I also appreciate that lunch is real soon now, and you might rather get to that and speak to me in the hallway.
Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. No questions? Any questions? No? Oh, yeah.
So when you move from going to just women to sort of any sort of person,
Mm-hmm.
did you ask people to self-identify? If, like, I know like
Yeah.
Oscon does this one way, and
Right.
I see it on a lot of different
Okay.
ways. Like, do you belong to an underrepresented group?
So,
or like to ask people specifically stay with one?
yeah, so there was, so the question was whether or not we asked people to self-identify. We left the gender question, or we asked people, certainly by 2015, the form of words we have was, are you a woman, question mark, and with the caveat that it was a non-required answer and that it might be used to offer particular types of grants from particular sponsors. But beyond that, we didn't ask people to self-identify beyond where they were from and what their background in Python was. So if they thought it was a relevant thing to include in their application, they were able to provide it, but it wasn't something we directly asked for. We judged more on the basis of their contributions.
Did you get people telling you, then did you get people saying, you know, as a person from a low income background or?
Yes, we often people will tell us what their financial circumstances are and what we need to, and how not having the funding would impact on their ability to attend. People often write really, really gushing and apologetic essays about how they can't afford the thing, much more than we ask for, and it's definitely something that affects us. But you know, we'll judge grants on the basis of what they provide, and that's all we can do. But not requiring people to provide information like that is really important as well, because you know, people might think that they don't deserve it because it costs so much, or because we're offering so much money for them. But you know, that's why we're doing this. We have money, we want to give it out. Yes?
And you mentioned you do like different levels of grants, right? So like someone might only need like, say, half their travel reimbursed.
Right. Yeah, so the observation was that, that we have different levels of grants now based on what needs are. Yeah, we will ask people what they need in order to attend. Previously, when we've asked about what they need, we'll say, how many nights of accommodation do you need? Where are you traveling from, and how much of that cost will you need? And then I'll go out and verify what the airfares are for that location to the city that the conference is in, to make sure that our dollar is going well. I'm not quite sure how we'll figure out how much we'll grant to people once we start saying this is not just for travel. That's an open question. But we do still need to make sure that, A, we do the right thing by the conference so that we can get as many people as we can, but that we're also giving a meaningful grant to people so that they can actually get to the conference when we say, hey, here's this money for you. Because that's really, really important. You can say, here's $500, but if you're going to travel from India to Australia, $500 is not going to get you to the conference, and that's going to be 2 months of your wage for the remainder. Yes, Deb?
So I have one more question. I know for PyCon US, they it's pretty focused on the travel and accommodation
Uh-huh.
Because most of the meals and all common rates and everything is already paid for there. Is it the same at AU, or
So,
do you also let people buy lunch?
So the question was, is the focus that PyCon US has is on travel and accommodation because meals are catered at PyCon US. For the most part, we have made sure that lunch is catered. That was a thing that didn't happen in 2014 when we handed over to another team They had different budgetary issues. They had a really terrible venue who were not particularly good at offering reduced meals for lunch. So it got to the point where you actually couldn't afford lunch. And that impacted on the ability of students to attend, because our student ticket, $50, getting a burrito every day would cost you $12. But we didn't offer grants for meal expenses that year, and we probably should have.
I saw Grace Hopper did,
Mm.
they had a number of different vendors that provided lunch. And
Yeah,
based in
but-
Houston, and everyone got like a $10 voucher per day.
Right.
And I don't know if they finagled
Uh-huh.
that by being like, there's going to be another 12,000 people that will just pay for lunch. So
Right.
for them to accept that.
And certainly that's what we see now when we offer a minimal lunch, is that some people will go out to nearby restaurants. Running at a venue where you can go out the door and get decent food, actually a really good way to make sure there is more food available for lunch, so you only cater for half the people or whatever, or have smaller lunches. This has gone for a really long amount of time, so I think we should go out and get some lunch. Thank you all. No. The questions have been really, really valuable, and it's given me more stuff to talk about for the next version of the talk. Thank you all for coming again. It's been great to give this.